Okay, I think we should go ahead and get started. So thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. My name is Dakota Hufford. I am the Communications and Program Coordinator for Clackamas River Basin Council. And I am joined by Amy Barton, our Communications and Stewardship Manager. And we are hoping to be shortly joined by Eric Butler, our riparian specialist, who gave a lot of contribution to this presentation. So thank you again for being here with us. This is the first of a series of 5 webinars designed to help you be a better steward to your land here in the Clackamas Basin. All right, so just really quickly, our schedule is just a quick intro, then we will talk about why we care about invasives, and then we will go over some of the more common invasive plants and how to remove them, and then some easy alternatives to be planted instead. And then we will end with a Q&A session. Our goals for today are for you to just kind of learn / check in, relearn what an invasive plant and native plant is, why you should care about that knowledge, and then again, just common plants that should be that are invasive here in the Clackamas Basin, and then common natives to replace them with. We absolutely do want to hear all of your questions, but we are relatively short on time. So go ahead and save those for the end, and then we can't wait to hear them. And now Amy with our mission.
Yes, hello everybody. So here at the Clackamas River Basin Council, our mission is to foster partnerships for clean water, to improve fish and wildlife habitat, and enhance the quality of life for those who live, work, and recreate within the Clackamas River Basin and beyond. We are a 501c3 nonprofit watershed council, and for the past over 20 years now, we've been investing in and restoring and protecting the Clackamas River and all of its tributaries. And we do this in a variety of ways. We conduct in-stream and riparian projects. The photo on the left shows our contractors installing large wood in a stream for fish and wildlife habitat. Large wood is really good for our streams and rivers. And then through our Shade Our Streams program, our wildfire recovery efforts, as you can see on the photo on the right, and through other restoration projects, we've planted over 630,000 trees in the last 10 years. We also offer stewardship events like our Down the River Cleanup, which is shown in the middle image, and we've removed over 50,000 pounds of trash since we started that great event several years ago. And we partner with all different types of entities, other nonprofits, federal, state, and local agencies, community planning organizations, water providers, as well as individuals like yourselves and schools to get this work done. So can't do it without you.
Awesome, thank you, Amy. Okay, we're gonna just dive in as soon as it wants to. There. All right, so what is an invasive plant? We will just talk briefly about some common terms that we hear when we are thinking about where a plant may come from and its interactions with a new environment. So naturalized refers to a non-native plant that grows on its own with little to no economic impact. Examples of some of these are plantain, wild plum, white clover, dandelions, and the other types. There are 2 types of plantain. And then in ecology, the 10% rule postulates that of all species introduced to a region outside of their native range, only 10% will survive and reproduce in their adopted environment. And this 10% of non-native survivors are what we call naturalized. So then we also have introduced, which means that it was brought in from another part of the world. And then we have invasive, which spreads into and takes over new habitats and outcompetes the natives. And then finally noxious, which causes harm to people, property, and or resources. They have an economic impact, noxious plants do. So are invasive and noxious plants the same? Not necessarily. Many noxious weeds are invasive. Invasive plants include not only noxious weeds, but also other plants that are not native to this country or to the area where they're growing. So there's some overlap, but they're not necessarily the same. Noxious really refers to a lot of that economic impact. And then, so what's a native plant? According to the Forest Service, it is a plant that it is part of the balance of nature that has developed over thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And when we say native, it is always referring to its geographical location. So either native to a watershed, state, region, or continent. So these plants have adapted and co-evolved alongside the native fauna. And as such, these species have a dependent relationship in which if a native plant is eliminated from an environment, that area may no longer support the natural wildlife, making room for more non-native species and creating a positive feedback loop. This, so I have the Portland plant list here, and then I do have a bunch of other resources that are going to be available in the comments in the chat. So check out this Portland plant list and some of the others as well. They'll all be on the website too. So why do we care? A new study, very new study, is showing that invasive species cause as much annual economic damage worldwide as other big events like earthquakes or storms. And they do this in a variety of ways. They displace native wildlife. And so when invasive plants take over an area, that means that native plants won't be there. And our native wildlife depend on these plants assemblages to survive. So this produces an overall less functional ecosystem, which does have economic impacts. Plants that haven't adapted here do not have the same environmental capabilities of those that have. So for example, our native shrubs have extensive root systems that help prevent erosion and help to stabilize our soil. And so our native willows are considered fire resistant due to their high moisture content, whereas invasive species can negatively impact fire regimes through a couple of different ways: by altering fuel bed loads, altering moisture content, overall moisture content, and the ignitability and the continuity and structure of a landscape. So, and then by changing the intensity of a burn. So that non-native plant will change the intensity, has the potential to change the intensity of the burn. And then by doing this and by creating conditions that are less resistant to fire, they also inherently make it a better environment for them. So the invasive species will just continue to spread. I have a great resource in the resource section on the fire resistant plants published by OSU. And then some of the other more obvious casualties of invasive plants are our forests and our large areas of land. It's really hard to manage that large of a space. So they can also cause great damage to crops, which does impact the agricultural industry. And then finally, invasive species can negatively impact human health even, and this happens by either infecting humans with new diseases or serving as vectors for existing diseases or causing wounds through other allergens and toxins. So there are certain invasive plants that are extremely dangerous to touch. And more about why do we care? So 90% of our insects in the Pacific Northwest rely on a native plant to complete its life cycle. Coevolution and adapting together over millions of years replaced by invasives results in a highly less functional and suitable ecosystem for wildlife. And insects being the basis of every food web, this is incredibly important, and we are facing an invertebrate extinction crisis. So providing the adequate foraging plants and habitats for them is one thing we can do to help our local bugs. Native vegetation also protects water quality and stream temperature. And stream temperature is the most telling water quality indicator. Anything over 64 degrees will create a stressful environment for fish and other organisms, and anything over 72 degrees becomes lethal. Additionally, the complex root systems that our native plants have really help protect banks from erosion and can help filter out pollutants from stormwater runoff. And then on top of everything, the Pacific Northwest has a very unique and special plant assemblage. And I think it is just a neat reflection of of where we live and the plants that are from here. Okay, so now on to the meaty bits, the actual plants that are that we are hoping to replace. So we're going to start with butterfly bush. This is a tall deciduous shrub. It commonly escapes into vacant lots in natural areas. You will see it taking over, and even sterile plants sold in local nurseries can still produce seeds or pollen. So this is still being sold in nurseries. It does produce a lot of nectar, but it's not as beneficial for insects as other plants. Additionally, this one is, if a single stem breaks off, it can create a whole new plant. It reproduces incredibly quickly. And so some ways to control this are to put smaller plants with a shovel, pull the smaller plants with a shovel or weed wrench, so really get down in there. Deadhead after blooming, so you prevent any seed spreading or anything like that. And then in the fall, you can cut and spray your stumps with a herbicide, with a specific herbicide. And then some ideas of what to plant instead with similar looks but better ecological results are the serviceberry, this beautiful white flower, the Ceanothus, the Blueblossom, and then a red flowering currant.
Okay, I'm going to share a little bit about the invasive knotweed. This is one of my personal least favorite plants out there right now. It is having a massive impact in the Clackamas watershed and beyond, and we are seeing it spread. It is a very large deciduous herb. It can grow up to 18 feet tall, and it forms a very large thicket, especially in our riparian areas or close to water. So you can see in that bottom picture there on the left just how big those thickets can become. It was planted because it is a pretty looking ornamental plant. It does have little white tassel flowers on it, but it spreads really easily by little root fragments. So any piece of this plant can become a new plant. So if you try to cut it down, things like that, it'll spread. It looks kind of similar to bamboo. So you can see the stalks anyway. You can see the stalk there on the right. And it has those nodes along the stalk, kind of like a bamboo plant does. And yes, the classic heart-shaped leaves that it has here, you can see those in the upper picture there. It is very, very aggressive, so aggressive that it can outcompete other very invasive weeds such as blackberry. So definitely want to get on that plant right away. A lot of times people don't recognize it because it just looks like a nice, pretty big shrub. But once you see it and you know what it is, you'll see it all over the place. All right, so how do we get rid of the knotweed? I have some bad news for you. You have to use herbicides. It is the only way to get rid of it. Like I was saying earlier, if you cut this plant down or try to dig it up in any way, those little tiny pieces of the plant that are left behind can become new plants. So if you're near a waterway especially, those little pieces of the plant can wash down the river, wash down the creek, and they'll just be new little friends or not friends that grow up everywhere. Herbicide is the way. We recommend that if you have this plant, that you contact the WeedWise program, the Clackamas County WeedWise program, or the Oregon Invasive Species Hotline for help, and we will put those links in the chat for you. And we're also going to email this out later. But yes, a very important plant to get on right away if you have it. There's lots of alternatives to plant instead. So when you remove that thicket, we recommend Red-osier dogwood. It's a beautiful flowering shrub, and it's great for pollinators. The little fruits will be eaten by birds and mammals. And it has the classic, as the name suggests, red twigs. The salmonberry, one of my personal favorites. It has beautiful flowers on it. Each plant just looks somehow different from the other plants. The leaves are all different shapes. Very, very pretty. And it has those white berries in the winter time that animals will eat. Also, the Sitka willow is a great choice to plant in that instead. If you flip the leaves over, they have kind of a silvery, light reflecting quality for all the little tiny hairs on them. So it's really just a shimmery, pretty plant, very great for wildlife. So I recommend those three. And I think Eric is here to talk about the lesser celandine.
Lesser celandine is a plant closely related to buttercup. It's a pretty familiar plant in a lot of urban yards, especially. People don't realize that it's actually a surprisingly noxious weed. It's a perennial, but it goes dormant in the summer. It usually disappears by about mid-April, but it blooms very early in the spring, often even late winter. But as you can see, it forms a very thick cover in yards, and it also spread into wet natural areas. And similar to the knotweeds, it has tiny little root bulblets that can continue to reproduce and produce new plants. And so it can be very hard to eradicate. It's also, like a lot of plants in the buttercup family, the sap can cause skin irritation. So if you're handling it, you want to handle it with gloves. Next slide. And this is one, thankfully, that there is some ways to manage it. You have to dig it very carefully and kind of sift through the soil to clear out this little bulbous. They can be about the size of grains of rice. You can also use certain herbicide formulations in spring once the flower buds appear. Once it's actually blooming, it becomes harder to kill. And because there's such a narrow window for treating it, it's often very rainy during that time of year. Herbicide's not always a viable option either. So I recommend trying to mix a variety of, try to combine mechanical and chemical controls to kind of do your best to knock it down. Thankfully, there are a lot of native wildflowers that do well in similar situations, kind of wet, part shady, or sunny to part shady situations. So red columbine's a very attractive one. Flowers are spectacular. Look, it's very, very attractive to native butterflies and hummingbirds. And then the seeds later will attract a lot of seed-eating birds. Western trillium's another very nice one, a very familiar spring wildflower. And one that's very similar looking is the yellow wood violet. It's this kind of spreading greenish ground cover with just very cheerful looking yellow flowers on it that blooms in early to mid spring. And it fills the same kind of role and the same kind of aesthetic, but it's a native plant that provides a lot of wildlife benefit.
All right, next is our ivy, our English ivy. I'm sure that everyone is pretty familiar with this plant at this point. We see it a lot in the Clackamas Basin and beyond. It is an evergreen, kind of woody vine. It does climb up trees and smother them. It can get so large, the individual vines, that they do get tree rings, and they're very, very big around and hard to control after time. They also can, dominate the understory. It creeps along the ground and shades out all the other plants. And eventually you have a monoculture, like you can see in this picture, where all that's left is ivy climbing up, and it's climbing up the trees. It does contribute to tree blowdown because it gets so heavy, especially during an ice storm. There's all this extra foliage that's covered in ice. And then that ivy can act as a sail. So when the wind blows, it'll just knock that tree right over. So we definitely want to get rid of that as soon as we can and save those trees. It spreads along the ground by vegetative growth. So it just, creeps along like a vine. It also has berries. So once it starts to climb something like a tree, the leaf shape actually changes. It looks different. And then that vine will have berries on it. It'll flower and have berries. And birds do eat the berries and spread it all over the place. So good to control that as soon as you can. It has very shallow roots. The roots are almost aerial in a way. If you were to pull some up, you'll see these just little tiny roots along the vine. So we definitely don't recommend it for erosion control. I think that it has been planted for that purpose in the past. So how to control it? Luckily, because it has such shallow roots, you can pull it up pretty easily. So you can hand pull it from the ground. There is a method to do this, which Eric calls the vertical lift, horizontal pull method. Works pretty well. So you pull the vine up like this, which detaches the roots, and then you pull it horizontally like that to get the vines up. When you have a lot of it and it's taking over, you know, an entire hillside or several acres, it can become a big endeavor. But there are ways to do it where you can cut it, you know, use trimmers to cut it in lines all the way up, and then you can kind of roll it up like a carpet. I've seen people do that before if you want to get big chunks. But first and foremost, the most important part is just to cut it off the trees so you can protect those large trees on your property. So to do that, we recommend cutting the ivy at about chest height all the way around the tree, and then cutting again at the bottom, and then you can pull around a 3-inch diameter around the outside of that tree just to pull the ivy away from the tree. And then we do not recommend that you pull the ivy off the tree. It can be very tempting and satisfying to do that, but the ivy roots do get into that bark. So if you were to pull it off, it might pull the bark off with it. So if you just let it there, just cut it off, cut it at the bottom, and let it die, it'll just dry out on its own and eventually fall off. And then if you are going to spray it, perhaps if you're going to spray around the ground to control it, we would say do that in the fall, because that's when that plant is going to start sucking nutrients down into its root system so it can get ready for the winter time. So fall is a really good time to use that. And then what to plant instead? We recommend kinnikinick. It is such a sweet little native plant. It does grow pretty slowly, but once it does help with erosion quite a bit. It holds onto that soil really, really well. It has berries on it that are eaten by wildlife, so it's a great choice. We also have the creeping Oregon grape. Oregon grape is, of course, our native flower in Oregon. Such a pretty plant. And it does have really pretty yellow flowers and berries that are eaten by an abundance of wildlife. They are edible to humans as well, but maybe not as tasty. And the salal also is a really great choice. Another evergreen, all of these are evergreen, shrub, low growing. It has berries on it as well, which I hear are a little bit more tasty, and they're supposed to be very rich in antioxidants, and there's some omega fatty acids in there as well. So those are all really great choices. Once you get all that ivy out of the way, we recommend that you plant those guys instead.
One very attractive flower that was actually introduced as a garden ornamental is purple loosestrife. It's a perennial herbaceous plant. As you can see, it has these tall spikes of these showy purple pink flowers. Very attractive, but it also runs rampant in wetlands and riparian areas. And it can smother out native vegetation. This plant has taken over some of our best loved wetland areas. About a decade ago, this stuff was absolutely smothering Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge in southeast Portland. And thankfully, they introduced a biocontrol that's really hammered it down, but it's still one that can be very problematic. And so, even though it looks like a great garden specimen, it's a rather menacing plant. Thankfully, purple loosestrife is relatively easy to control. If you have small populations, you can hand pull it or dig it from the ground. The root systems are fairly shallow, and I've successfully hand pulled the stuff from gravel and cobble bars along the Clackamas River. But if you've got heavier soils, a shovel works pretty well too. If you have bigger patches, you can try mowing and deadheading. Just hitting it repeatedly can help keep the populations in check, keep it from spreading, eventually exhaust it. A good time to spray it is right around as the bloom is starting to fade, when it's easily identifiable. It hasn't started setting seeds yet. And there are biocontrols out there as well. There, as I mentioned before. So if you have a big patch and you aren't seeing evidence of biocontrol on it, contact Oregon Department of Agriculture about that, and they can evaluate that your site as a potential location for doing a biocontrol release. And instead, there are a lot of beautiful native wildflowers that have a very similar aesthetic and that do well in the same kinds of sunny, wet environments. So a great example is camas, which is a lily-like flower with these beautiful purple blooms that appear in May and June. Showy fleabane is another great one. Meadow checker mallow is also a great native wildflower for these kinds of environments. It's very attractive to a lot of butterflies and such.
Okay, our next invasive plant for you is holly, English holly, which is fitting to cover this time of year because we see this a lot around the holidays. It is a pokey evergreen shrub, and it can be kind of like a small tree. It gets really pretty tall. It's often used in hedges, so you'll probably see it all around your neighborhoods, and it has those bright red berries that are spread into natural areas by birds. And it can be really hard to get rid of this plant once it has established and wherever it is. And then keep in mind that every part of this plant is toxic. So not good to eat the berries. The leaves are not great for livestock or any other animals. Okay, so how do we control it? We say that you should dig these plants, the smaller ones that you can get to with a shovel or use a weed wrench. So make sure you really get in there, get the entire root system if you can. It can be hard once the tree gets to a certain size to get that out of there. If it's too large for you to dig out, then the best way to remove it is then to cut the tree down in the fall, kind of like the other plants. They start to suck down those nutrients in the fall. So that's a good time to do it. And then you paint the stump or the frills with a concentrated herbicide. So there are certain types of herbicides that we will provide through our website. And those will really help kind of soak in there and really get that plant. If you do just cut it down and then leave it and don't put an herbicide on it, it can pop up all over the place from suckers from the root system that still exists. So one plant can turn into 20 or 30 or 40 more of those. So just be aware of that when you're trying to deal with it. And then what to plant instead, the tall Oregon grape, like I said, our state flower. We love it. Beautiful flowers. It looks kind of similar to the holly. So they are often confused, but you can tell because the holly has alternating pokey leaves and the Oregon grape has directly across leaves. Another plant is the wax myrtle, a beautiful kind of larger shrub. And the wax myrtle does have a particular value to the yellow-rumped warbler. Not a lot of birds can ingest the berries. They have a very thick wax coating on them, but the yellow-rumped warbler can. And it has that wax has a high fat content, and it helps that warbler overwinter. So great plant for those birds. And also the evergreen huckleberry, another slow grower, but very, very beautiful shrub that's great for erosion control with edible berries as well for humans and wildlife.
There are also a number of weeds that are really just starting to get established in our area, and these are ones that we really want to hit now. A key concept is called early detection, rapid response. If you remember back to the beginning where we saw the invasion curve, it's a lot easier and a lot cheaper and a lot simpler to manage invasive species when they're very new, when their populations are small, when they have not spread around very far. By the time they get as widespread as a lot of the species we've talked about, we're really just trying to keep a lid on them. You can potentially spend thousands or millions of dollars really just trying to manage them after they're already out of control. So species like garlic mustard or giant hogweed, puncture vine, water primrose, or policeman's helmet, if you see these, let someone know. File a report with the Oregon Invasive Species Hotline or contact your local weed management agency. We want to know about these. We want to be able to get them under control, potentially even eradicate them before they are out of control.
So just by being here and caring, you are being part of the solution. And so our watershed, just like many others, are rapidly changing due to many human-caused changes in development and other issues, and many streams and waterways and natural areas are heavily impacted by these changes. So by you stewarding your own space and helping to spread the word to others about native plants and the reporting of the early detection of these new noxious species that Eric was just describing, you are being part of the solution and you can help mitigate these environmental changes on a community level. So thank you. And thank you so much for being here. Just really quick to blast out our upcoming webinars. We have one every month for until April. They are all available to sign up on our website. Please reach out if you have any questions about those. And at this point, we will just open it up for any questions or general comments.